Please help us. The little black girl begged the biker while an announcement called a name she didn't know. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun was setting on a warm summer evening in the small town of Riverton. The air was filled with the sweet scent of cotton candy and the hum of carnival rides. The laughter of children echoed through the grounds as families enjoyed the festivities. However, amidst the joy and celebration, a little girl was running as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was no more than 9 years old, her face streaked with tears, her dress torn and dirty from her frantic escape. She was barefoot, her small feet bleeding from the sharp gravel beneath her. She didn't care about the pain. All that mattered was finding help, someone who could save her family. Her eyes, wide with fear, scanned the crowd desperately until they landed on a group of bikers gathered at a booth. Their jackets gleamed in the fading light, the colorful patches on their backs signifying a brotherhood bound by loyalty. They weren't just any bikers. They were part of a club called the Iron Riders, known for their protective nature and willingness to stand up for those in need. Without a second thought, she sprinted toward them, her voice trembling as she cried out, "Please help us." The bikers, who had been casually chatting and enjoying the carnival atmosphere, froze when they saw her. Jack Hawk Morrison, the leader of the group, was the first to step forward. His worn leather vest shimmered with the Iron Riders insignia, and his face, hardened by years of experience, softened with concern. He knelt down to her level, his deep voice calm yet firm. "What's wrong, kid? Tell me what happened." The little girl's eyes welled up with more tears as she grabbed his vest, shaking with fear. "They took my brother," she sobbed. "Please you have to help me get him back." Jack's heart sank as he listened. The mention of her brother, her desperate plea, hit him like a gut punch. He stood up quickly, his mind already racing with questions and plans. "Where did they take him?" he asked, his voice steady, though inside, he felt the weight of the situation. The girl pointed frantically toward a silver SUV speeding away in the distance, its tires kicking up dust as it disappeared from sight. Jack turned to his crew, his expression hardening with determination. "The Serpents," he muttered under his breath. A chill ran through the group as they recognized the name. The Serpents were a rival gang, known for their brutality and criminal activities. This was no small matter. This was serious. "Get on your bikes. We're going after them," Jack commanded. The Iron Riders sprang into action, each biker moving with precision and purpose. Their bikes roared to life, the sound echoing across the carnival grounds like a thunderstorm rolling in. The little girl, still clutching Jack's jacket, looked up at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "You'll bring him back, right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack knelt down again, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll bring him back," he promised, his voice low and fierce. "I swear we will." As the riders mounted their bikes and revved their engines, Jack gave one last glance toward the carnival, now fading in the distance. They had no time to waste. The chase had begun, and there was no turning back now. The Iron Riders were already in motion, their bikes roaring to life with a collective growl that could be heard for miles. The group of bikers moved like a well-oiled machine, their movements synchronized as they tore through the streets of Riverton. Jack's mind was racing, but his focus was razor-sharp. There was no time to waste. Every second counted. The little girl's face, streaked with tears, haunted him. They couldn't afford to lose her brother. They couldn't afford to fail. The convoy of Iron Riders sped down the highway, their engines humming in perfect harmony. Jack took the lead, his dark eyes scanning the road ahead. Behind him, the other riders fell into formation, each one prepared to follow him wherever the chase would take them. The wind whipped through their hair as they surged forward, leaving the carnival and the chaos behind. They were in pursuit now, and there was no turning back. As they reached the outskirts of town, the landscape changed. The bright lights of the carnival faded into the dark, sprawling fields and forests of Riverton's rural outskirts. The roads became less familiar, twisting and turning through dense woods. Jack's grip tightened on his handlebars as he adjusted his speed, his senses on high alert. He knew the Serpents well. They were ruthless. They were dangerous. And now, they had a young boy in their clutches. Jack couldn't shake the thought of what could be happening to him. The child's life was at risk. His mind replayed the girl's words over and over again, each time making his stomach churn. They took my brother. Jack pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Ahead, Bear, the biggest and toughest of the riders, was on the radio. I've got eyes on the silver SUV. It's a few miles ahead, moving fast. Copy that. Jack responded, his voice low and determined. He glanced back briefly to make sure the rest of the group was still with him. Phantom, the club's former high school teacher, was in the rear, keeping the group organized and steady. They couldn't afford to lose sight of each other. Stay tight, Jack said over the intercom. We stick together. No one splits off. They roared through the night, the rumble of their bikes punctuating the otherwise eerie silence of the woods. The moon cast a pale light on the road ahead, illuminating their path. The chase was intense. They were getting closer. But so was the danger. The Serpents weren't going to give up the boy easily. Jack could feel it in his gut. The tension in the air was thick, the kind of tension that only came with a life-or-death pursuit. They needed to reach him before it was too late. As they hit a sharp turn, Jack saw the headlights of the silver SUV up ahead. The vehicle was moving fast, weaving through the trees like it was trying to shake them off. Jack's heart rate quickened. They had to stop the SUV before it disappeared into the night. He signaled to the others. Brace yourselves. We're closing in. The Iron Riders pushed forward with everything they had. The roar of their engines grew louder as they gained on the SUV, and Jack's adrenaline surged. He could see the vehicle now, just a few hundred yards ahead. The Serpents inside were completely unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. They were focused on escaping, thinking they had the upper hand. But they were wrong. The chase had just begun. Jack barked orders into his headset. Bear, flank them on the left. Phantom, take the right. The rest of you stay on my 6. The riders responded in unison, their voices crackling over the intercom as they prepared for the final push. Jack's mind was laser-focused. Every turn, every movement, was calculated. They were about to make their move. The SUV swerved again, this time taking a sharp exit onto a narrow road. Jack cursed under his breath. They're trying to lose us in the back roads, he said. We can't let that happen. He hit the throttle hard, the bike leaping forward. The Iron Riders followed suit, their engines screaming in unison as they shot down the winding road. The trees whipped past them in a blur. The SUV was getting closer. Jack's eyes narrowed. He could almost see the driver's face, could almost hear the sound of the tires skidding as they fought to maintain control. The Iron Riders were relentless. They would not stop until that boy was safe. With one final push, Jack and his crew gained on the SUV. It was a race against time now. Who would reach the boy first? The chase was nearing its peak. The silver SUV ahead of them was no longer weaving between trees, but barreling down a narrow dirt road, trying to lose the Iron Riders in the thick darkness. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his eyes never leaving the taillights of the SUV, glowing red in the distance. His pulse raced, but his focus remained steady. Every moment brought them closer to the child who needed them. Stay tight, Jack ordered into the headset. His voice was calm, but everyone in the group knew how high the stakes were. They had to move fast. The road ahead narrowed, the trees closing in on both sides, turning it into a tunnel of darkness. Jack's mind raced through the options. They couldn't afford to lose the SUV, not when the boy's life was on the line. The engines roared behind him as the Iron Riders sped forward, cutting through the night like a thunderstorm on two wheels. The trees whipped past them, barely visible in the shadows, their leaves brushing against the riders' leather jackets. Jack spotted a bend in the road ahead. It was their chance. Bear, Phantom, get ready, Jack said, his voice sharp. The riders split as they approached the curve, two of them pulling ahead while the others fanned out, surrounding the SUV. Jack stayed on course, his eyes locked on the rearview mirror of the SUV, anticipating the next move. The SUV swerved hard to the left, making the turn at full speed, but the driver was losing control. The tires screeched against the gravel, and the SUV fishtailed. Jack knew this was their chance. Now he barked. With precision, the Iron Riders charged. The SUV, now fully aware that they were closing in, accelerated in a desperate attempt to outrun them, but it was too late. The bikes were everywhere. Jack's Road King surged forward, and he heard Bear's booming voice in his earpiece. "I've got him, boss. No way out." The silver SUV was trapped between the bikers, its path blocked by the massive machines of the Iron Riders. Jack's eyes narrowed as he signaled to Bear, who moved in quickly to block the SUV's exit. Jack revved his engine, bringing his bike up to the side of the SUV, forcing it to slow down. The rider behind him, Phantom, matched his movements, keeping the SUV from escaping. The driver of the SUV slammed on the brakes, trying to veer left, but the path was blocked. He threw the gear into reverse, desperately trying to back up, but there was nowhere to go. The moment of truth had arrived. Jack cut the engine, the roar of the bike silencing as he approached the SUV. He took off his helmet, his scarred face now visible to the driver. The man inside the vehicle was sweating, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew he was trapped. Jack approached the driver's side window, his voice low and menacing. "You have one chance," Jack said, his words carrying the weight of every promise he'd ever made to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The driver's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. He was boxed in, outnumbered, and surrounded by the unforgiving will of the Iron Riders. "I don't want any trouble," the driver mumbled, his voice trembling. Jack's gaze never wavered. "Then get out of the car," he ordered. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The driver hesitated, looking at the other riders who were now surrounding the vehicle. He finally unlocked the door and stepped out, his legs shaking. As he stood face to face with Jack, the weight of the situation hit him. He had no power here. Jack's jaw clenched as he glanced at the rear seat. "Where is the boy?" he demanded. The driver swallowed hard, his face paling. He didn't answer right away, but his hesitation spoke volumes. Jack stepped closer, his voice steady but forceful. "Tell me where he is." The man stammered, pointing toward a small shack on the far side of the dirt road, hidden by the trees. "He's in there. Please, don't hurt me." Jack nodded. "Get out of the way," he commanded, and the man quickly moved aside. Jack turned to Bear. "Watch him. He doesn't leave until we get the boy." The rest of the riders remained on high alert, watching the surroundings for any sudden moves. They knew the Serpents were unpredictable, and things could escalate in an instant. Jack led the charge, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved toward the shack. The others followed closely, their bikes parked in formation to ensure that no one would escape unnoticed. The tension in the air was palpable. They were about to face the moment they had been riding toward for miles. As they approached the shack, the door creaked open, and a small figure appeared in the doorway, blinking in the dim light. It was the boy. His eyes were wide with fear, his clothes dirty, and his body trembling. But he was alive. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, but the job wasn't done yet. "You're safe now," Jack said softly as he knelt down to the boy's level. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Jack helped him to his feet. "Let's get you out of here," he said, turning toward the others. As they made their way back to the bikes, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They had saved the boy, but there was still work to be done. The Serpents were far from finished, and this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. The air was thick with tension as the Iron Riders moved swiftly back toward their bikes, the boy, Jamal, safely in Jack's care. The light from their motorcycles illuminated the dark road, casting long shadows as they made their way toward the rest of the group. Jack's heart was still pounding from the intensity of the chase, but the relief that Jamal was in one piece was overwhelming. His eyes briefly flicked to the shack where they had found the boy. It was a reminder of just how close they had come to losing him. Jack glanced over at Bear, whose heavy footsteps echoed on the dirt. "Get the man in the SUV out of here," Jack ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Make sure he stays put." Bear nodded without hesitation, heading toward the driver they had left behind. Jack turned back to Jamal, who was now sitting quietly on the bike behind him, clutching his vest with both hands. The boy's face was still pale, his eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. "You're safe now," Jack said quietly, glancing back at the boy. Jamal looked up at him, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Jack gave him a reassuring nod, though the situation wasn't over yet. They had gotten Jamal back, but there was still the matter of the serpents and their twisted, vengeful hold over the area. They couldn't let their guard down. "We need to get back to town and make sure he's all right," Jack said, his voice low. "We'll take him to the hospital, but we need to move fast." The ride back felt different, more urgent. The sound of their bikes filled the night, but there was an underlying sense of danger now, one that wasn't going to be shaken off so easily. As they neared the outskirts of Riverton, Jack caught a glimpse of headlights in the distance. He didn't need to look twice to know it wasn't the police. His gut told him it was more trouble. "Get ready," Jack muttered, signaling for the group to tighten up. As they rolled through the quiet streets, the headlights grew closer. Jack knew they were being followed. "Phantom," Jack said, his voice now all business. "Check our six." Phantom's voice came back almost immediately. "Yeah, we've got company. Looks like 2 cars, maybe more." Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened. "They're coming for us," he muttered under his breath. They were back on the road, but now it wasn't just about getting Jamal to safety. It was about dealing with the danger that had been following them ever since they left the carnival. The Serpents were about to make their move. As they approached the edge of town, Jack could hear the roar of engines behind them, growing louder by the second. "They're closing in," Bear called out, his voice steady, but with a hint of concern. "We need to lose them now." Jack's eyes scanned the road ahead, trying to figure out their best option. He needed to get Jamal to safety, but the riders behind them weren't going to let that happen easily. "Take the back roads," Jack ordered. "We're losing them in the woods." With that, the Iron Riders veered off the main road, cutting through a narrow dirt path that twisted between the trees. The headlights behind them followed, but the path was too narrow for the cars to keep up. Jack pushed the throttle harder, the wind rushing past him as he maneuvered the bike through the darkness. The sound of the other bikes and cars grew distant, but Jack's instincts told him they weren't out of the woods yet. Literally, as they sped down the rugged dirt road, Jack looked over his shoulder and saw the 2 vehicles skidding to a stop at the edge of the woods. The Serpents weren't giving up. They were going to fight, and they weren't going to let them get away. "Get ready for trouble," Jack said, his voice grim. "We've got company ahead." The headlights of another set of cars appeared from the other side of the woods, cutting off their escape. Jack swore under his breath. "Looks like we're surrounded," he said. The riders tensed, their fingers on their handlebars, ready for whatever came next. Jack's mind was racing. He had to think fast. "Phantom, take the left," he ordered. "Bear, stay on the right. The rest of you cover me." Without hesitation, the Iron Riders formed a line, surrounding the vehicles on all sides. Jack's heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. He knew what had to be done. The Serpents were a threat, but they weren't prepared for what was about to happen. As the cars pulled closer, Jack saw the faces of the Serpents inside the windows. They were looking for a fight, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Jack took a deep breath and signaled to his crew. "Now," he said. With one swift move, the Iron Riders surged forward, cutting off the Serpent's path. The air was thick with tension as the riders confronted their enemies head-on. Jack wasn't about to let the Serpents win. Not now. Not when Jamal's life was on the line. The engines roared, and the standoff began. The tension in the air was palpable as the Iron Riders circled the Serpents' vehicles. Jack's eyes never left the men in the cars. They were dangerous, and they were desperate. It was clear they weren't going to give up the boy without a fight. The headlights from the cars cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road. Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened. "We need to end this now," he muttered under his breath. The Serpents were outnumbered, but they weren't going down without a fight. Jack knew this could get ugly. The bikers had the advantage in speed and maneuverability, but the Serpents had something else, brutality. Jack signaled to his crew, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Bear, keep your eyes on the right. Phantom, stick with me on the left. The rest of you be ready." The Serpents' cars were inching closer, and Jack could see the men inside, their faces grim and determined. They had been on the run for years, and losing wasn't an option. Jack's mind raced. They needed to intimidate the Serpents, make them back down without a single shot being fired. He couldn't risk more violence, not with Jamal so close. "On my signal," Jack said, his voice low but sharp. The riders tensed, the engines of their bikes growling in unison. The Serpents were now within striking distance. One of the cars inched forward, its engine revving as the driver made a threatening move. "Now," Jack barked. Without hesitation, the Iron Riders revved their engines, surging forward like a storm. The sound of the motorcycles roaring to life drowned out the silence of the night, sending the Serpents into a panic. They slammed on the brakes, trying to back up, but the Iron Riders were already on top of them. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he cut through the dark, his bike weaving between the vehicles, forcing them to stop. "Move now," Jack yelled at the Serpent drivers. The cars were completely blocked off, surrounded by the bikers on all sides. The riders spread out, blocking any potential escape routes. The Serpents' faces turned from anger to fear as they realized they had no way out. Jack stood tall, his leather vest gleaming in the dim light from the motorcycles. "This ends now," he said, his voice steady and commanding. The leader of the Serpents, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, glared at Jack, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. "You don't know who you're messing with," the Serpent leader growled. Jack took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the man's eyes. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," he said coldly. "And I'm not backing down." The Serpents exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the situation was slipping out of their control. Jack could feel the tension crackling in the air, but he refused to let fear take hold. He had a promise to keep. He had to protect Jamal. "Get out of the car," Jack ordered, his voice unwavering. The Serpent leader hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the door and stepped out. He was tall and imposing, his muscles bulging beneath his leather jacket. "You think you can just stop us?" the man sneered. Jack didn't flinch. "I think I just did," he replied, his tone flat. Behind him, the other riders moved in, their eyes locked on the remaining Serpent vehicles. The leader of the Serpents tried to make a move, his hand reaching for something inside his jacket, but Jack was faster. In one swift motion, he disarmed the man, pulling his weapon out and tossing it aside. "Not today," Jack said, his voice firm. The Serpent leader looked around, realizing he was outmatched. His crew, now realizing they were surrounded, slowly got out of their cars, their expressions ranging from fear to defiance. Jack didn't take his eyes off them. "We're done here," he said, his words carrying the weight of finality. The Serpents looked to one another, their pride hurt, but they knew better than to challenge the Iron Riders now. Slowly, they backed away, climbing into their vehicles and driving off into the night. Jack watched them leave, his heart still racing. He hadn't wanted it to get violent, but sometimes that's what it took to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "Let's get Jamal to safety," Jack said, turning back to the boy. He wasn't out of danger yet, but the immediate threat had been dealt with. Jack walked over to Jamal, who had been watching the standoff in silence. "You okay, kid?" Jack asked, kneeling down to his level. Jamal nodded, his face pale but relieved. "Yeah, thank you for saving me." Jack smiled gently, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're safe now. Let's get you home." With the threat behind them, the Iron Riders revved their engines once more, ready to continue their ride. The night was far from over, but Jack knew they had done what they set out to do. They had saved a life. The Iron Riders continued their ride through the night, the weight of what they had just done still heavy on their minds. The road was quieter now, the sounds of the bikes reverberating through the cold air, but there was an unspoken understanding between the riders. They had faced down the Serpents and saved Jamal, but Jack knew that the danger wasn't over. Not yet. He glanced back at the boy, who was sitting quietly on the bike behind him, his small arms wrapped tightly around Jack's waist. Jamal had been through more in a single night than any child should ever experience, and Jack could feel the tension still lingering in his muscles. Jack had seen a lot in his time, but something about the look in Jamal's eyes made his heart ache. The boy was scared, shaken, but there was also a spark of gratitude. Jack had promised to protect him, and tonight, that promise had been kept. But there were still threats out there, lingering in the shadows. The Serpents wouldn't be easily defeated, and Jack knew that the war wasn't over. As the bikes tore through the open highway, the night air grew colder. The city lights of Riverton faded behind them, and they found themselves on the outskirts of town, the darkness of the country road stretching ahead. "We're almost there," Jack said over the radio, his voice steady but carrying a sense of urgency. "Stay sharp. The last thing we need is another surprise." The riders tightened their formation, each one aware that they couldn't afford to drop their guard. The Serpents had made their move earlier, and Jack was sure they would try again. He couldn't let his crew get complacent. The bikes rumbled through the quiet night, the only sounds being the hum of engines and the occasional crackling over the radio. Jack's eyes scanned the road ahead, his mind racing with what was to come. The tension was thick, but the riders were experienced. They'd been through worse. But this situation, with a child involved, was different. Jack felt the responsibility weighing heavily on him. He had promised to protect Jamal, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. As they neared a small, isolated house on the outskirts of Riverton, Jack slowed his bike. It was a modest house, nestled between two thick rows of trees, with a faint light shining through the window. He knew this place. This was where they had planned to take Jamal, a safe house for moments like this. Jack signaled for the riders to stop. "This is the place," he said, his voice calm but firm. The bikes came to a stop, their engines dying down one by one, and the riders dismounted. Jack helped Jamal off the bike, the boy still holding on tightly to him. Jack knelt down to his level. "You're safe now, okay?" Jamal nodded, but Jack could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to expect next, and neither was Jack. "We'll get you settled in here," Jack continued, his tone gentle. "You'll be all right." Jamal gave a small, uncertain smile, but Jack could tell he was still processing everything that had happened. Jack stood up and turned to his crew. "Bear, keep watch. Phantom, stay with the boy. The rest of you, make sure the perimeter is secure." The riders moved quickly, setting up a perimeter around the house, ensuring that no one would be able to approach unnoticed. Jack turned back to Jamal, who was now sitting on the porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the boy. He was so young, yet already forced to grow up too fast. Jack approached him, kneeling down beside him. "Hey," Jack said softly. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" Jamal shook his head, his voice small. "I don't want to remember." Jack nodded, understanding completely. "I get it. You don't have to, but I'm here if you need to talk." The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a sense of peace here. For the first time since the chase began, Jack felt a small sense of relief. They had brought Jamal to safety, but he knew it was only temporary. The Serpents were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jack looked out into the night, his thoughts drifting back to the Serpent leader they had captured earlier. He couldn't let them get away with this. He'd made a promise to Jamal's father, and he would keep that promise. He would hunt down the Serpents if he had to, but for now, Jamal was safe. Jack stood up and turned to face the rest of the group. "We rest here for the night," he said. "Tomorrow, we make sure they don't come back." His voice was low but firm. The riders nodded in agreement, their faces set in grim determination. They had a job to finish, and it wasn't over yet. But for tonight, they had kept their promise. And that was enough for now. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the quiet countryside as the Iron Riders settled in for a brief moment of peace. Jack stood on the porch of the small house, his eyes scanning the horizon. The night had been long, but they had successfully kept their promise to get Jamal to safety. Now, as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, Jack knew that they couldn't afford to rest for long. The Serpents were still out there, and they would come for them again. He had to make sure that Jamal and everyone else were completely safe. Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had spent so many years riding for justice, fighting for what was right, and this time, it was personal. He had promised Jamal's father that he would protect his family, and that promise was all that mattered now. Jamal was safe for the moment, but the battle wasn't over. Jack turned and walked back inside the house, where the boy was sitting in the corner, wrapped in a blanket. He looked up at Jack as he entered, his big brown eyes filled with confusion and fear. Jack smiled softly, crouching down beside him. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Jamal's eyes wandered to the ground, and he hesitated before speaking. "I'm okay," he said quietly, though his voice trembled. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now. You're with friends who won't let anything happen to you." Jamal gave a small nod, but didn't speak again. Jack understood. The boy had seen too much, been through too much in one night. There was no easy way to undo that kind of trauma. Jack glanced over his shoulder, where the rest of the riders were gathered in the living room, discussing their next move. They were all on edge, the weight of what had happened hanging heavily in the air. Jack knew they needed to move quickly. He couldn't let the Serpents regroup. "We leave in an hour," Jack said to the group, his tone decisive. We're going to make sure they don't come after Jamal again. The riders nodded, their expressions grim. They were ready. They had been through battles before, but this one felt different. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for a kid who had no business being caught up in this world. Jack turned back to Jamal, who was now sitting up straighter, his hands gripping the edges of his blanket tightly. Are you ready? Jack asked softly. Jamal looked up at him, his face still uncertain but a flicker of determination in his eyes. I think so, he whispered. Jack smiled. Good. You're stronger than you think. As Jack made his way to the door, he glanced at the rest of the riders, all preparing their bikes. They were ready. The air was thick with anticipation. They knew the stakes. They knew the Serpents wouldn't give up easily, but they also knew they had to stand their ground. The ride wasn't just about protecting Jamal anymore. It was about sending a message. The Iron Riders were here to stay. As the group mounted their bikes and the engines roared to life, Jack felt a sense of resolve wash over him. They were headed into the heart of danger, but they weren't alone. They had each other. The convoy of bikes surged forward, the sound of their engines breaking the early morning silence as they hit the open road. The wind whipped against their faces as they sped through the countryside, their destination clear in their minds. They were headed straight for the Serpent stronghold, ready to take the fight to them. Jack's grip on his handlebars tightened as they neared the edge of town. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins. The Serpents had made their move once, but they weren't going to get away with it. Not this time. The rest of the riders flanked him, their bikes in perfect formation as they moved swiftly through the winding roads. Jack could see the anticipation in their faces as they approached the enemy's territory. They had one goal in mind: to protect Jamal, to send a message that no one was above the law, and to show the Serpents that they had made a grave mistake. The sun had fully risen by the time they reached the outskirts of the Serpents' hideout. Jack signaled to the group to slow down, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. The hideout was well hidden, surrounded by tall trees and a high fence, but Jack had been here before. He knew what to expect. He leaned into his headset, his voice low but firm. We hit them hard, we hit them fast. No mistakes. The riders nodded, their faces determined as they prepared for the final push. Jack took a deep breath, knowing what was coming next. They were about to enter enemy territory, and they had to be ready for anything. As they approached the entrance, Jack could see the Serpents standing guard, watching for any signs of movement. It was clear they weren't expecting the Iron Riders to show up on their doorstep. Jack revved his engine, signaling the start of the confrontation. With a roar, the Iron Riders surged forward, their bikes roaring like thunder as they charged into the Serpents' hideout. The Serpents scrambled, trying to react, but it was too late. The Iron Riders were on them, swift and relentless. Jack's heart raced as they tore through the enemy lines, each rider moving with precision and purpose. They weren't here to start a war. They were here to end one. The Iron Riders stormed into the Serpents' hideout like a force of nature. The sound of roaring engines filled the air as they cut through the enemy lines with precision, their bikes moving as one. Jack led the charge, his eyes focused and intense as he wove between the Serpents' guards. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his mind remained sharp. This was what he had trained for. This was the moment when everything came together. The Serpents were caught off guard, scrambling to react as the Iron Riders surged forward. Jack saw one of the Serpents' men draw a weapon, but it was too late. Bear was already on him, grabbing the gun and twisting it out of his hand in a single fluid motion. Not today, Bear growled, tossing the weapon aside. The rest of the Serpents were in disarray, trying to regroup, but the Iron Riders were too fast, too well-coordinated. Jack barked orders into his headset, his voice commanding. Stay tight, no one breaks off. We hit them all at once. The riders responded with a synchronized roar, tightening their formation as they moved deeper into the hideout. Jack's heart raced as they pushed forward. This was it, the final push to take down the Serpents and ensure Jamal's safety. He couldn't afford to let up now. The Serpents' hideout was a rundown building, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows shattered. It wasn't much to look at, but it was their base of operations. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were about to bring the fight to the heart of their enemy's territory. There was no turning back. The riders surged into the building, kicking down the door and charging inside. The Serpents, still trying to regroup, had no idea what hit them. Jack's eyes scanned the room, taking in the chaos around him. Men were scrambling, trying to draw weapons, but the Iron Riders were always a step ahead. Phantom, the club's former teacher, took point, clearing the way as the rest of the riders followed. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus never wavered. They had come this far, and they couldn't afford to lose now. As they moved through the building, Jack heard a voice crackling over the radio. "We've got them cornered," Bear's voice rumbled. "They're not getting out." Jack's lips curled into a smile. "Good. Keep them there. No one leaves until we have everything." The building was eerily silent as the Iron Riders moved through the dark hallways, their boots echoing on the concrete floors. The only sound was the distant hum of their motorcycles outside, waiting. Jack could feel the tension mounting as they approached the heart of the hideout. He knew they had to finish this quickly. The Serpents were dangerous, and they weren't going to surrender easily. Jack's mind raced as he mentally prepared for what was to come. They had taken down the outer defenses, but now they had to face the heart of the operation, the leaders of the Serpents. He could already feel the weight of their eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to make a move. As they entered a large room, Jack saw them. Two men standing near the far wall, their backs to him. They were the leaders of the Serpents. The two men turned, their eyes flashing with recognition. Jack's grip tightened on his bike, ready for whatever came next. "You're not getting away," Jack said, his voice cold. The Serpent leader, a tall man with a rough face, sneered. "You think you can stop us? We own this town." Jack stepped forward, his face hardening. "Not anymore." With one swift move, he raised his hand, signaling the riders to move in. The Iron Riders closed the gap, surrounding the Serpent leaders. The two men looked around, their faces contorting with anger and fear. "You can't do this," one of the men growled. "We'll make you pay for this." Jack stepped closer, his voice unwavering. "You're done." Without another word, Jack motioned for his crew to move in. The riders swiftly subdued the two leaders, disarming them and tying them up, making sure they couldn't escape. As the last of the Serpents was taken down, Jack let out a breath of relief. The fight was over. They had won. But Jack knew it wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about sending a message. The Serpents had terrorized this town for too long. The Iron Riders were here to protect, to ensure justice was done, no matter the cost. As the Serpent leaders were escorted out of the building, Jack turned to Jamal, who had been quietly watching from the corner. The boy's eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Jack walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now," Jack said softly. "This is over. You're going to be okay." Jamal looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. Jack gave him a reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. It's what we do." The Iron Riders stood tall, their faces hard but filled with pride. They had done what they came to do. They had protected the innocent and sent a message to those who thought they could terrorize others. Jack looked at his crew, nodding in approval. They had completed their mission. They had saved the day, and they had done it together. The morning sun was now fully up, casting its golden rays over the quiet town. The streets that had been filled with chaos just hours earlier now felt peaceful, but the lingering tension still hung in the air. Jack and the Iron Riders stood outside the Serpent's hideout, watching as the remaining Serpent members were loaded into police cars, their heads lowered in defeat. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. Jack knew that much. As the dust began to settle, the weight of the events started to hit Jamal. The boy, who had once been terrified and alone, now stood beside Jack, his face more at ease, though still bearing the marks of what he'd been through. Jack placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, giving him a small but sincere smile. "You did good, kid," Jack said, his voice steady, but full of pride. Jamal looked up at him, eyes wide. "I didn't do anything," he replied quietly. Jack shook his head. "You stayed strong. That's enough." The Iron Riders, having completed their mission, began to gather their gear, ready to leave the scene. The local police were now taking control of the area, ensuring that the Serpents were fully detained. Jack watched as the officers worked, but his thoughts were elsewhere. They had saved Jamal, and that was what mattered most, but something gnawed at him, something he couldn't shake. The Serpents were just a piece of a larger puzzle, and they had made powerful enemies. He couldn't rest easy until the whole operation was dismantled. "We've still got work to do," Jack muttered under his breath. Phantom, who had been standing nearby, overheard him and nodded. "I know," he said. "The Serpents won't stop here. We've just made a dent." Jack exhaled deeply, his mind already shifting to what needed to be done next. But for now, there was something that needed to be addressed. Jamal. He turned back to the boy, who was looking at the departing police cars with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Hey," Jack said softly, crouching down to Jamal's level. "You good?" Jamal nodded slowly, but didn't say anything. Jack could tell that the events of the past day were still weighing heavily on him. "It's okay to be scared, you know," Jack said, his voice kind. "You've been through a lot. But you're safe now. You're with people who care about you." Jamal looked up at him, his expression uncertain, but something in his eyes softened. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack smiled, a reassuring warmth in his gaze. "And you're going to be okay. We'll make sure of it." As Jack stood up, Bear walked over to them, wiping his hands on his leather vest. "We've got a long road ahead, but for now, let's get the kids somewhere safe. You all did good." Jack nodded, but his gaze stayed focused on Jamal. The boy had been through hell, but now, at least, he had a chance at peace. As they walked to their bikes, Jack could feel the weight of the decision ahead. The Serpents were just a part of a larger network, and if they didn't do something about it now, more people would suffer. But for now, they had done the right thing. Jamal was safe. They had fulfilled their promise. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, but that feeling was fleeting. There was still so much more to be done. As the Iron Riders revved their engines and set off down the road, the sound of the bikes echoing in the still morning air, Jack's thoughts were already shifting. They had stopped one threat, but many more were still out there. The town was far from safe. The Serpents might be out of the picture for now, but Jack knew that there would always be someone else trying to take their place. That was the world they lived in. He glanced over at Bear, who was riding alongside him. The big man's face set in determination. "We need to gather intel on the rest of the network," Jack said, his voice serious. "We can't just sit back and wait for them to regroup. We need to find them before they find us." Bear grunted in agreement. "You know I'm with you, boss." The Iron Riders rode in silence for a while, the road stretching out ahead of them, but Jack's mind was still racing. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, and the stakes were higher than ever. But at least for now, Jamal was safe, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. As they rode further into the morning, Jack couldn't shake the thought that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The war wasn't over yet, and the Iron Riders were ready to face whatever came next. The ride back to town was long, the air still cool from the early morning, but Jack could feel the heat of determination building within him. The Iron Riders had completed their mission. Jamal was safe, but Jack knew this was far from over. The Serpents were only one part of a much bigger picture. There were still dangerous people out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Jack couldn't let that happen. As they entered Riverton, the familiar sights of the town came into view, but it felt different now. It felt like the calm before the storm. They had faced down the Serpents, but Jack knew there would be more to come. "We need to regroup," Jack said, his voice low but urgent. He glanced back at the riders behind him. "We're not done here." "Not yet." The group nodded in agreement, their faces grim, knowing full well what Jack meant. They had to keep fighting, keep pushing forward. There was no going back. The town might have seemed peaceful, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time before the next threat came knocking. As they rode through the town, Jack's thoughts turned to Jamal. The boy had been through so much in such a short time, but he had come out on the other side stronger than Jack had expected. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more the boy needed to process. Jamal had witnessed violence, fear, and loss, things no child should ever have to endure. Jack knew it was important to help him heal, but that wasn't something that could happen overnight. It would take time, and for now, all they could do was keep him safe. As the riders arrived at the small house where Jamal would stay, Jack pulled his bike to a stop. The sun was now fully up, casting a golden light over the town. The day was just beginning, but the riders knew their work was far from over. They dismounted their bikes and approached the front door. Bear, as always, stood at the ready, keeping an eye out for anything that might happen. Jack turned to the rest of the crew. "We keep watch," he said, his voice steady. "We make sure no one comes for Jamal. We'll figure out our next move later. Right now, his safety comes first. The riders spread out, some standing guard around the house, while others checked the perimeter. Jack turned back to the door, watching as Jamal entered the house with a member of the crew. The boy didn't look back, but Jack could see the weariness in his posture. Jack's heart went out to him, but he couldn't let that show. Not now. Not when there was so much at stake. As the house settled into silence, Jack took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, but he wasn't going to back down. Not when so many depended on him. He had promised to protect Jamal, and he would keep that promise no matter what. He glanced at Bear. Keep the rest of the crew in line. We can't afford any mistakes. Bear nodded, his usual gruff demeanor showing signs of approval. I got it, boss. Jack turned his attention back to the house, his thoughts swirling. He had to figure out what came next. The Serpents were only the beginning. They had to find out who was really behind the chaos, and Jack wasn't going to stop until he had the answers. As the hours passed, the riders remained vigilant, watching for any signs of trouble. Jack's mind never stopped working. He knew the Serpents weren't acting alone. There was a bigger network, and if they didn't dismantle it soon, there would be more innocent lives at risk. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he wouldn't let that stop him. He had a responsibility to Jamal and to everyone else in this town. He wouldn't fail them. As the day wore on, the riders gathered inside the house, the tension thick in the air. Jack took a seat at the table, his mind focused on the task ahead. We need to dig deeper, Jack said, his voice sharp. We can't let the Serpents get away with this. We need to find the rest of their operation, take it down, and make sure this never happens again. The riders nodded, their faces serious. They knew the fight wasn't over, and they weren't about to stop until the job was done. Jack stood up, his determination unwavering. We ride at dawn. The Serpents may be gone, but the real enemy is still out there, and we're going to find them, no matter what it takes. As the Iron Riders prepared for what lay ahead, they knew the road would be long and dangerous. But they also knew that together, they could face anything. They had fought side by side before, and they would do it again. Jack looked at each of them, his eyes steady, his resolve unshaken. We do this for Jamal. We do this for the people who can't fight for themselves. We do this because it's the right thing to do. The riders nodded in unison, ready for whatever the next day would bring. The battle was far from over, but they were prepared. They would fight until the end. The Iron Riders gathered in the dimly lit room, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Jack stood at the center, his arms folded, eyes hard with determination. The weight of the past days, the battles, the victories, and the losses, all seemed to hang in the air like a cloud. They had defeated the Serpents and protected Jamal, but Jack knew the fight wasn't over. The real war was still ahead. He turned to his crew, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We've got one shot at this. The Serpents were just the tip of the iceberg. The people behind them are much bigger, more dangerous. His words were met with a collective silence. They all knew what he was implying. The Serpents had been just one arm of a much larger criminal network, and until that network was dismantled, the town would never be safe. Jack glanced over his shoulder, making sure Jamal was still inside the house, away from the danger. The boy had been through enough, and Jack didn't want him to witness what was coming. We need to find out who's really behind all of this, Jack continued, his tone unwavering. And we need to do it quickly, before they regroup and come after us. Bear, the massive biker with the gruff voice, spoke up first. How do you propose we do that, boss? We've got no intel, no way to track them down. Jack didn't flinch. We start with what we know. The Serpents' hideout, the people they worked with, the ones who financed their operation. We need to find out who gave them the resources to operate freely for so long. Phantom, the former teacher turned strategist, nodded. We've already made some inroads. I've been listening to some chatter. There are whispers about a bigger group, one that controls everything from drugs to arms deals, money laundering to protection rackets. Who's running this show? Jack asked, his voice sharp. Phantom hesitated, his face tight with concern. We don't have names yet, but we do know it's someone powerful, someone with connections. We need those names, Jack said, his voice growing more forceful. And we need them fast. As the riders discussed their next move, Jack's mind raced. He knew the risks. The people behind the Serpents wouldn't be easy to find, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got in their way. Jack had been through wars, both literal and figurative, but this felt different. This wasn't just about protecting the town. It was about stopping a much larger threat. Jack turned back to his crew. We need to hit their finances first. Whoever is funding them has to be stopped. If we can cut off their resources, we can take down their operation. The riders nodded in agreement, their faces set in grim determination. They knew that Jack was right. The Serpents had been dangerous, but the people behind them were even more so. And as long as they had the money and resources, they could rebuild their power. Jack looked at his crew, seeing the resolve in their eyes. They were ready. We leave at first light, Jack said, his voice steady. We find their money trail, and we burn it. The riders nodded in unison, the sense of unity stronger than ever. They had faced the Serpents and won, but this mission would be different. This time, they weren't just fighting to protect Jamal, they were fighting to take down an entire network. As the riders prepared for their next move, Jack took a moment to reflect. They had already lost too many lives to these criminals. Too many had been hurt, and too many more would suffer if they didn't act quickly. But Jack knew they weren't just a group of bikers. They were a brotherhood, a family, and no one would harm their family without facing the consequences. The next morning, the Iron Riders set out, their bikes roaring to life as they tore down the road. The sun was barely up, casting a pale light over the horizon, but Jack felt the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just a ride. It was a war, and they were ready for it. As they rode through the quiet countryside, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Serpents were gone, but their masters were still out there, and Jack was determined to bring them down. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Iron Riders would stop at nothing to protect the innocent and make sure justice was served, no matter what it took. The morning air was heavy as the Iron Riders made their way deeper into the heart of enemy territory. They had gathered their intel, and now it was time to act. The mission was clear. They had to stop the flow of resources that fueled the Serpents and their powerful backers. As they rode, the roads grew narrower, the countryside giving way to the more industrial areas, where the operations of the criminal network thrived. Jack kept his eyes focused ahead, his mind sharp despite the weight of everything that had happened. He knew they were getting closer to the heart of the operation, and with every passing mile, the danger grew. The Iron Riders had already faced down the Serpents, but now they were after the ones pulling the strings. Jack wasn't about to let them slip away. They had been through so much already. Too many people had been hurt. It was time to put an end to it. The bikes roared through the morning haze, their engines vibrating in perfect unison, sending ripples through the still air. The sound of their approach was like a warning, a sign that the riders were ready for whatever came next. As they reached the outskirts of a rundown industrial area, Jack signaled for them to slow down. This was it. Their target was close. They were going to hit the facility where the Serpents had been laundering their money and running their illegal operations. Jack's gaze swept over the area, looking for any signs of movement. The place was quiet, too quiet. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was too easy. He motioned for the riders to spread out, each of them taking a position to cover all the possible exits. Jack knew that getting inside wouldn't be easy. They had to move fast, hit hard, and make sure they didn't leave anyone behind. As they approached the entrance, Jack could see the guard station up ahead. Two men stood watch, their eyes scanning the area. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady. This was what they had trained for. They had to be ready for anything. Without a word, Bear, always the first to take action, crept forward, moving like a shadow through the trees. The other riders followed suit, taking their positions with calculated precision. Jack stayed at the back, his eyes scanning for any other threats. His pulse quickened. They were almost there. Bear took out the guards swiftly, using the element of surprise to disarm them before they even had a chance to react. The riders moved quickly, using the cover of the trees to slip past the perimeter fence. Jack led the way, his eyes fixed on the building ahead. The sound of their bikes had already stirred up the guards, and now they had to be in and out before backup arrived. They reached the door, which was locked, but Jack knew exactly what to do. With one swift kick, the door flew open, and the riders stormed in, their boots thundering against the concrete floor. Inside, the operation was in full swing. Men were counting money, moving stacks of bills from one table to another. The room was filled with the scent of stale air and the hum of machinery. Jack took it all in an instant. his eyes scanning the room for the most dangerous threats. The Iron Riders moved like a well-oiled machine, taking out the guards one by one, securing the exits, and making sure no one could escape. Jack's eyes locked onto the man standing at the back of the room, the one who seemed to be in charge. He was tall, with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. Jack didn't hesitate. He moved forward, his boots echoing in the silence. The man turned, his eyes widening when he saw Jack approaching. "Who the hell are you?" the man sneered, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his side. Jack didn't give him a chance. "You've been running this show for too long," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "This ends today." With a swift motion, Jack lunged at the man, knocking the gun from his hand before he could even raise it. The man tried to fight back, but Jack was too fast, too strong. He took the man down in seconds, slamming him against the concrete wall. "You're done," Jack growled. "This whole operation is over." The man struggled to breathe, his face red with anger and fear. "You'll never stop us," he spat, but his voice was weak, defeated. Jack stood over him, his face hard. "We already have," he said simply. The rest of the Iron Riders gathered around, securing the area and ensuring that no one else could escape. Bear walked up to Jack, giving him a nod of approval. "We've got it under control," he said, his voice calm but determined. Jack exhaled deeply, looking around at the room that had once been a stronghold of criminal power. It was over, but Jack knew that the fight wasn't completely won. There were still people out there, pulling the strings, and Jack wasn't going to stop until every last one of them was taken down. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice steady. "We've done what we came to do, but this place is going to attract attention. Let's move." The riders quickly gathered up the evidence they needed, destroying the rest of the operation to ensure it couldn't be rebuilt. As they made their way back to the bikes, Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had struck a blow to the heart of the criminal network, but the war wasn't over yet. As they rode out of the compound, Jack couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They had protected Jamal. They had taken down the Serpents. And now, they were going to finish what they started. The sun was starting to set as the Iron Riders rode out of the compound, their engines roaring with the weight of victory. The day had been long, filled with danger and uncertainty, but now they were heading back to the town they had sworn to protect. Jack glanced over at the crew, each one of them reflecting on the battle they had just fought. There was a sense of accomplishment in the air, but Jack knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Serpents had been taken down, but they were only a small part of a much larger network. They had struck a blow, but the real fight was still ahead. As they rode through the quiet streets, Jack's thoughts kept drifting back to Jamal. The boy had witnessed more than any child should, yet he had remained strong. Jack had promised to keep him safe, and that promise had been fulfilled for now. But what about the future? Jamal had been through so much, and Jack knew that he would need more than just protection. He would need time to heal, to find a sense of peace after everything he had experienced. Jack's gaze shifted to the road ahead. They were almost home. The town was still and quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, this place had been under the threat of the Serpents, a criminal organization with its fingers in everything from drugs to money laundering. But now, that threat was gone. Jack knew that they had done something important, but there was still more to be done. The Serpents weren't the only ones operating in the shadows. There were others out there, other networks of criminals who would try to fill the void the Serpents had left behind. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jack made a decision. They would take the fight to the heart of these other networks, no matter how long it took. But for now, they needed to rest. They needed to recover from the war they had just fought. The riders pulled into a small parking lot near the town's diner. Jack parked his bike and dismounted, the others following suit. As they gathered around, Jack looked at each of them. "We've done good," he said, his voice steady but full of pride. "We've made sure that Jamal is safe, and we've taken down the Serpents. But this isn't over. We know what's out there, and we need to keep pushing forward. The town needs us." The riders nodded in agreement. They knew what had to be done. This was their fight, and they weren't going to stop. "We'll figure out our next move after we get some rest," Jack continued. "But for now, let's take a break. We've earned it." They made their way into the diner, the small bell above the door ringing as they entered. The waitress behind the counter smiled at them, recognizing the familiar faces. Jack sat down at a booth, the rest of the crew following suit. The diner was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the air conditioning and the clinking of silverware. Jack looked over at Jamal, who was sitting quietly beside him. The boy had been quiet for most of the ride, but now he looked up at Jack, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," Jamal said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack smiled, his eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me, kid," he said gently. "You did good. You're safe now, and that's all that matters." Jamal nodded, but Jack could see the weight of everything that had happened still sitting heavy on his shoulders. The boy had been through a lot, and Jack knew that healing would take time. But for now, they had won, and that victory was enough. As they sat in the diner, sharing a quiet meal together, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had done something good, something meaningful. They had fought for what was right, and in the end, they had made a difference. But deep down, Jack knew the fight wasn't over. It would never be over. As long as there were people like the Serpents out there would always be more work to do. But for now, they had a moment of peace, and Jack was going to hold on to it. He looked at his crew, his brothers, and knew that they would face whatever came next together. They were ready, and they always would be.